and welcome to this edition of Hidden History Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co-host, Ray Smith. Good afternoon, Ray.
Hello, Keith. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm good. And we have got a guest with us that we've had on a few times before.
We
And
have.
I'm going to let you introduce him, Ray.
Yeah, I'll be glad to. We've got Dr. Todd Ryder with us again today. Todd has brought us a number of insights into the German nuclear program, and he's going to continue that theme today. But I think it's been most interesting for us to be able to look at his research and to look at what was actually going on, not only what was happening during the war, but he's also showed us that some of the things that we have not really known where they came from actually had their origin with those Germans and with those forgotten creators that he's brought us as we've had our series up to now. So, Todd, we'll let you take over and bring us the next segment of the forgotten creators of the German nuclear triad.
Well, thank you both for inviting me back. I apologize for being a recidivist. And as usual, let me acknowledge all the people and all the archives that helped in finding the evidence I'll show you. It was not just my work, but a lot of people, a lot of places worked to uncover all this evidence. And on the last exciting episode of our show, we talked about how during the war, Germany had been developing nuclear bombs, and they'd also been developing the means to deliver those bombs. Now, during the Cold War era, we think about the nuclear triad as being three different methods to deliver nuclear weapons, three different methods developed by the US and the Soviet Union. And what I can show is that the entire nuclear triad actually had its origins in Germany during World War II. All three types of methods were being used, were under development to deliver German nuclear weapons to Allied targets. So we've talked about the nuclear payloads. They came in small, medium, and supersized. Last time we talked about the land-launched intercontinental missiles, 1 if by land. This time it's 2 if by sea and 3 if by airmail. So we'll cover these, starting with submarine-launched cruise missiles. Now, everybody's familiar with the wartime German V1 missile. It was essentially the world's first cruise missile, at least the first fully operational cruise missile. It first flew in 1942, and here were some of the German creators of this. It was essentially a small pilotless jet plane with a bomb on board, and it required a running start to get off, so it was launched from catapults, generally on the European coast toward England. What people are less familiar with, though, are the modifications, the improvements of the V1. And so here is a declassified post-war investigation by the Allies of advanced V1s found in archives. And it says 2 further developments of the V1 program were an attempt to launch the missile from the ramp of a submarine, the deck of a submarine, and a project for a piloted V1. In the first case, the ramp was constructed on the submarine. It's believed this was intended for attacks against coastal towns and defenses on the eastern seaboard of the USA. In the second instance, the piloted V2, it's known that several models were constructed. It was intended that the pilot should fly the missile to within a short range of the target, set the controls, and then jump out. And here you see one of these piloted V1s that was captured. And these things are actually test flown by German test pilots, like the famous Hanne Reich during the war. So in theory, the pilot could bail out in time before hitting the target. In practice, this was probably a suicide mission for the pilot. I'm not sure what the German word for kamikaze is, but I'm sure it's much longer. And anyway, so they had piloted versions. They had versions that could be launched on submarines. I will show you those in a moment. And they had versions that could be carried under the wing of larger aircraft and then an air-launched cruise missile. Of course, nowadays we have the Alcom air-launched cruise missile. So they had all 3 of these versions. They also had nuclear armed versions that they were at least working on. Here is another declassified post-war Allied report. This was from an interrogation of Edmund Zorg, who was highly placed in this program. The British got him, were interrogating him after the war. This is in British archives. And he describes an improved manned V1 with atomic energy as a charge. In short, a manned controllable atomic bomb, which can be certainly released by modern, fast, large airplanes close to its target. That would ensure a safe destruction of the target, given that it is in the hands of a pilot ready to sacrifice himself. So the pilot rides the atomic bomb down just like Slim Pickens. So this was interesting. This was apparently much more than merely a paper idea. Previously, I've mentioned Hans Kammler. He was the SS general in charge of all these programs. At the end of the war, he was captured and secretly interrogated by the United States. This was one of the last things he sent before he surrendered to the Americans. So late April, he sent this telegram to his subordinate saying it was extremely urgent that they immediately blow up the V1 devices near Berlin. So destroy all the evidence, destroy all the evidence. Now, V1s, normal V1s were a dime a dozen. So there was something very, very unique, very interesting about these particular V1s that he wanted destroyed. So where are all the reports on there? So there must be all kinds of Allied and even captured Axis reports on this, certainly interrogation reports on Hans Kammler. Where are all these reports? They're still missing. They're still withheld from the public. I gave a document that described a sub-launched V1. Here's another document, and this is from the FDR Presidential Library. It says that photographs were taken in September 1944, so well before the end of the war. Photographs were taken of a submarine that was apparently designed to launch V1 missiles. So they had photographs. This was a drawing taken from the photograph to clarify it, but they actually had photographs. It'd be possible to launch a missile from the submarines. And so from the FDR library, the entire Roosevelt administration, top people in the US were deeply concerned that Germany apparently had developed the means to launch V1 missiles from submarines and intended to launch those against the United States. So this was September 44, and throughout late 1944 into early 1945, you see all kinds of now declassified high-level telegrams and cables from people, everybody from Dwight Eisenhower to J. Edgar Hoover, talking about detailed evidence for these sub-launch missiles. So from Eisenhower, U-boat will be leaving European waters shortly to launch V1s against New York. From other generals, reliable information, German U-boats are equipped with bomb launching platform. 4 U-boats were to be used in operation against New York. Even reports that a U-boat had actually attempted to launch missiles against New York, and either that failed or was somehow defeated by the Allies. So these reports continue into early 1945. Submarines would proceed within 100 to 200 miles of the United States and then fire these rockets. Here is from the US Admiral in charge of the whole Atlantic Fleet, saying that it's not only possible but probable that these things are being developed, will be used against the United States. So from very, very high level sources, they're all saying exactly the same thing. And yet we don't have the corresponding reports. Where are the reports for all of this? Now, after the war, immediately after the war, the United States did a PR tour for Parade Magazine and everybody else, saying, look at this great new weapon the United States just developed after the war. This great new US developed weapon was a sub-launched cruise missile that just happened to look exactly like a V1 and just happened to be launched from the top of a submarine, exactly as described in those German documents. Very, very interesting. So this, proudly, purely USA developed weapon, if you lift up the rug, look underneath the rug, you start finding Germans and Austrians everywhere. So here were the people actually working on this program, Nazi weapon experts, former German scientists, here. And indeed, after the war, these experts went on to develop not just that, but further and further improved versions of cruise missiles, ultimately through the more modern types of cruise missiles we have now. Let's also talk about sub-launch ballistic missiles. And we really think of these as, post-war, Cold War US and Soviet inventions. But here are pictures from May 1942, 3 years before the end of the war. This is a German sub. It is launching ballistic missiles from underwater. Now, these are small ballistic missiles, but they are ballistic missiles. They're being launched from the sub as it's submerged. And so once this was successful in 1942, the Germans started trying to see if they could launch larger and larger and larger missiles from a sub. They built larger and larger versions. And most of the later tests were conducted not on the coast due to concerns about Allied bombing, but rather actually at a very deep lake in Austria. And all this was found by the US after the war. So the sub-launch ballistic missiles kept getting larger and larger until they actually worked their way all the way up to the V2 or the A4. Now this missile is larger than a submarine, so they had to be very creative in how they would carry this. And their idea was that a submarine would tow a trailer, a submersible trailer, and this trailer would cross the Atlantic following the submarine, riding horizontally. And then once they got off the coast of the United States, then they would stop. They would flood water into one end of this trailer, causing it to sink down, open up the doors, and they had a perfect launch platform for an A4 or V2 rocket. Now, again, people like to think of this as a paper design. It's reasonably well known in the books as a paper design, but this is from the actual German U-boat museum now. They say at the turn of 1944 to 1945, successful towing trials were actually executed using this. So they not only designed this, they built it, and they not only built it, they towed it around with submarines to make sure it would work. But where are the actual reports on these things? They've all vanished from the archives. In addition to the missiles, the submarine technology itself advanced greatly. The main U-boat people associated with Germany during the war was the so-called Type 7 U-boat. This was actually leftover German World War I technology. It was so advanced, decades ahead of its time, it was still useful in World War II. But the new subs they developed during World War II were much more advanced. They included the so-called Type 21 U-boat, which could stay submerged for a long time. And these captured Type 21s became the basis for post-war Soviet and US subs. And the Germans also developed very high-speed submarines, so high-speed they needed a rounded nose, like modern post-war submarines. They developed sonar as well. Sonar was invented by Alexander Baim in 1912, and then through the 19-teens, 1920s, 1930s, developed into very sophisticated sonar systems at several different German companies. Once the Allies got sonar, the Germans were very concerned about that, and so they developed anti-sonar. They developed stealth submarines. This is a 1943 photo of a stealth submarine coated with special rubber tiles to absorb the sonar pings. Then after the war, all the stuff was captured, brought to the United States as well as other countries. Again, we like to think of these ballistic missile programs in the United States as being purely US inventions, but lift up the rug, and there are Germans and Austrians everywhere. So here is Willy Fiedler, proud inventor of many of the key technologies for the Polaris sub-launch missile, the first US sub-launch missile. His name is plastered all over these patents. We've already mentioned previously Karl Klager, who invented the propellant for these missiles, as well as propellant for many, many other post-war US missiles and rockets. And that's just starting. So there's all kinds of Germans and Austrians just everywhere throughout these programs. So these technologies were developed during the war in Germany and Austria, and then transferred after the war. And the same is true for other countries. So if you look at the Soviet Union, their first sub-launch missile was launched a decade after World War II, so 1955. And their first sub-launch missile just happened to look almost exactly like a German Wasserfall missile, a wartime missile, essentially a half-size V2 or A4 rocket. So here's the German version from 1944. Here's the Soviet version from 1955. They're essentially identical, except for small differences in the fins to make this sub-launched instead of ground-launched. It was launched even from a Soviet submarine that had been directly based on the captured German Type 21 U-boat technology. So all this post-war technology came from wartime German creators, including many of those German experts who then went to these countries and were probably developing this in captivity in the Soviet Union. It also raises the question, though, that if German experts could use a German missile and launch it from a German-based submarine in the Soviet Union after the war, could they have done this during the war? So this may suggest that there were other wartime programs to do this. There were other advancements associated with submarines. So, of course, it's hard to send radio signals to a submarine. The water absorbs the electromagnetic waves. But if the frequency of the waves is really, really low, then you can actually get the waves to pass through water and through the Earth itself. And the best known example is the US Navy facility that was built at Clam Lake in 1980s. And so this transmitted extremely long wavelength waves through the ground and through the ocean so that the US government could communicate with their missile submarines around the world. Well, here it is, built, brand new technology in the 1980s. Here it is built in 1943, not just built, but operational. It was called Goliath, and this was the technology fully operational in Germany during the war, so they could communicate with their U-boats when they were underwater halfway around the world. The actual Goliath transmitter was seized by the Soviet Union and carried back to the Soviet Union and used there. So we've talked about land-launched intercontinental missiles. We've talked about submarine-launched missiles. The final component of the nuclear triad, as we know it, is intercontinental jet bombers. And of course, the early history of jet development in Germany is reasonably well known. Hans von Hahn, backed by Ernst Haeckel, aircraft designer, built the first turbojet engine in 1935. Together, they flew the first jet aircraft in 1939. And then during the war, many other German and Austrian experts, like these guys, developed fully polished jet engines. Those were installed on aircraft designed by many other experts. And so you had things like the Messerschmitt 262 twin-engine jet fighter that was first flown in 1942. So very advanced technology for its time. But the important thing is that after the war, all these folks, all their technology was scooped up by the United States and by other governments. And so they led to lots of post-war jet engines and post-war jet aircraft. What is somewhat less known is that there were less conventional aircraft designs in Germany during the war, in particular flying wings. And so the flying wing design here had very large wings, little or no tail surface area. And these were pursued particularly by the Horten brothers, two aerospace designers, but a number of other German aerospace experts as well. They actually built a fighter size jet wing bomber and demonstrated that during the war. We know from the history books that they designed larger versions, bombers to go between continents. Officially, those larger versions were simply paper designs, except there's suspicious evidence. And this was a response to a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request. And it says that immediately after the war, a number of German experts found US officials and said, we will build an intercontinental jet bomber for you immediately in exchange for food. So we'll build jet bomber for food. And they described exactly what they were proposing to immediately build for the United States. It was a massive flying wing jet bomber with 6 engines capable of going between continents. So 7,000 kilometer range, and 14,000 kilometers round trip. And the fact that they were proposing to immediately begin building this strongly suggests that maybe they had lots of experience with this. Maybe they had been building these things during the war. So a massive flying wing powered by half a dozen advanced jet engines. You've already seen the air-launched cruise missiles capable of carrying a pilot and atomic bomb that could be carried by an aircraft like this. Now, any resemblance of all this to the first Captain America film is purely coincidental, I'm sure. And then there's more evidence these things were actually built. Here's from the Chicago Daily Tribune. As allies were invading, finding all this stuff, both bomber and fighter types had been produced with 1 to 6 engines. Later models were jet propelled, so actually produced. Here's from the New York Times. The Germans planned to bomb New York and other eastern cities. They were within months of doing this with a fleet of jet-propelled planes. Prototypes were found. The Germans' New York bomber, a prototype, was found at an undisclosed location along with Dick Cheney, and it had 4 engines, 4 jet engines. So all this was found. But again, where are the reports? This is described, but we don't have the corresponding reports. Those are still withheld from the public. More reports. A lot of the stuff was associated with Norway. Germany controlled Norway throughout the war. And so here is a report from May 44, a year before the end of the war. And it says that the Luftwaffe is frantically building lots and lots of huge airfields in Norway. Now, why would they be doing that? It furthermore says that in addition to the airfields, they're setting up BMW there. Now, BMW was making the BMW 003 jet engine used by many of these jet aircraft. And they're setting up Heinkel there. And Heinkel was building a lot of these advanced aircraft. So this is a year before the end of the war. Immediately after the war, the Royal Air Force blabbed to the press. They said, oh yeah, at the end of the war in Norway, we were really surprised. We found these large airfields, and they had 40 giant Heinkel bombers. And the people there told us that they'd been built for raids on New York. They were waiting for the permission to go bomb New York. And so all this was found, all this was revealed by the Royal Air Force, published in the US military's own Stars and Stripes, as well as the Washington Post, LA Times, all over the place, and then just vanished. We have no official reports on this. So where are all of the reports? Why are they being withheld? So that seems to have come from Heinkel. As I mentioned, Ernst Heinkel ran his own aircraft development company. He was a very famous designer. His top designer was named Siegfried Günther. And after the war, some of their papers were captured by the British. Here they are from British Archive, showing these flying wing type designs. Also, after the war, Siegfried Günther was interrogated by the Americans. We know that he was captured by the Americans. He was forced to sit down and write down everything he knew about these giant flying wing bombers. And then the Americans said, thank you very much, and took all of his reports and left. So where are all these reports? They're described, but we don't have these reports. And we have information from other sources. This was Henry Fowler. He was the director of the US Enemy Branch Foreign Economic Administration. He gave testimony before the US Senate after the war. And he said, oh yeah, it appears that if the Germans had been able to prolong the war by 6 months longer, then they would have been mass producing and smashing New York City and other US cities with improved V2 bombs, so long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, as well as jet-propelled planes that could have reached Washington, so long-range intercontinental jet bombers. Here he admitted to the US Senate, yes, all this stuff was in development. Now, if it was being mass-produced, if they would have had large numbers of these 6 months after the war, they would at least have had prototypes by the end of the war. So where are the prototypes? And most importantly, where are the reports? Here's another report. This was from the Convair aircraft company that helped investigate all this stuff in Germany at the end of the war. And in Life magazine, immediately after the war, they said, yeah, just how slim the war was is known to military intelligence. They know all the stuff that Germany was developing. Some of these things cannot be revealed yet, but we talked to German rocket engineers, and the German rocket engineers said, oh yeah, we plan to destroy New York City and other American cities starting in November 1945, if the war continued. So these were clearly far more than just paper projects if they were this close to realization. This also says that the United States discovered prototypes of these intercontinental jet bombers after the war. So again, where are the prototypes? Where are the reports? Here's further information. This is from General Marshall himself. So after the war, he submitted an official report on the war and said that German technological advances, such as in the development of atomic explosives, made it imperative that we launch the invasion of Normandy when we did, before they could attack us with these terrible weapons. He also said that at the close of the war, that the factories in the United States, the eastern coast of the United States, was just on the outer fringes of the range of fire from an enemy in Europe. So there was technology that existed in Germany at the end of the war, capable of actually reaching the east coast of the United States. So where is that technology? Where are those prototypes? And where are the reports? There were other developments associated with the advanced aircraft, including radar. People like to think of radar as being something that was invented during World War II by the British and then improved by the Americans. And it was actually invented by the Germans in 1903, so long before World War II, even long before World War I. Invented in Germany. It was pursued at a number of companies in Germany, steadily advanced through the 1920s. Here's an improved high power radar. And then once the Allies got radar, the Germans decided they needed to develop anti-radar, stealth capabilities. So they developed radar absorbing coatings, special materials, special paints that could help to absorb radar waves, keep them from bouncing back to the Allies. And they also developed special aircraft designs, including the flying wing, and aircraft materials such as wood that would minimize the radar reflection. And again, all this was captured by the Allies. And so it appears that the post-war stealth technology was descended directly from this German wartime expertise. There are many more things we still need to learn. Much more research needs to be done on exactly how extensive this post-war influence was. So for example, in post-war aircraft by the US and other countries, we know that there were a lot of captured German and Austrian experts and designs, people like Hans Multop, Alexander Lippisch. We know that their work was highly influential in the development of a number of aircraft. We need to find out a lot more. This was in the United States, but similar things happen in other countries. So in the United Kingdom, Dietrich Kuppmann and Johanna Weber in particular lent their expertise to things like the Vulcan bomber and the Concorde passenger jet, supersonic aircraft in the UK. But much more research needs to be done to find out just how much influence there was. So to sum up, we know from publicly available sources that so much of this technology was developed in Germany during the war and then transferred afterwards. We only have a small fraction of that documentation that is currently available to the public. Much of it remains unavailable, classified, buried, and really needs to be found. And so hopefully people can answer these questions of just how far German work in these various areas got during the war, and exactly how much that influenced and how it influenced post-war work in the United States and in other countries. And that's true for the nuclear payloads themselves. How far did German nuclear weapons progress? It's true for the land-launched missiles, the submarine-launched missiles, and the intercontinental jet bombers. So there's enough work here to keep an army of historians busy for decades. And I'm really hoping that there's some people out there who might be interested in this and would take this up and carry it much further than I and other people have. So if anybody's interested in doing that, a good place to start is my book. It's available at my website. You can download it for free. It has well over 1,000 pages of information on this stuff, primary sources that I found in archives, exact locations in the archives where it all came from, good places to start digging. For the aerospace delivery vehicles, you can look at Chapter 9 for the short version or Appendix E for the long version if you're having insomnia. Again, it's available at my website. So this is for the aerospace delivery vehicles. For the weapons themselves, the short version is in section 8.8, and the full-fledged 1,000-page version is in Appendix D. So I will stop there.
Well, thank you, Todd. I'm amazed at the amount of information that you've been able to gather. Can you share with us where have you found the most useful sources of your information?
Oh, that's a great question. Let me pop back to my acknowledgments slide and I'll show you some of the archives. Really archives around the world, some yielded more information, more relevant information than others. In the United States, the National Archives are great. So College Park is the main one, but there are smaller ones in various other parts of the country. So for example, the Oak Ridge records are stored in Atlanta.
Yes.
But I spent several months digging through College Park, found all kinds of stuff. Some of these other people have also dug through College Park. The Air Force did not send their documents to College Park. Instead, they set up their own Air Force Historical Research Agency in Alabama. So I spent several weeks in Alabama in their room full of microfilm in summer with no air conditioning, trying to read as many microfilms as I could. But tons of information came from there. There are a few other good archives in the US, but those are really the biggies. And then in Europe, the UK has excellent archives. I found some stuff in Germany, found stuff all over the place.
Todd, how long have you been working on this for you to come up with this incredible document?
Thank you. I've been interested in these various topics for a long time. I'm a scientist by education and career, but I thought I could do better science if I studied how previous scientists had made their discoveries. So I've spent several decades reading about the history of science, trying to learn from what other scientists have done and how they did it. But I really got serious about writing this book, pulling things together in 2016. So I started writing and sending out portions of this in 2016, and then put all the Forgotten Creators online at the beginning of 2020.
Wow, that's incredible.
Keith, I'm glad to say that as he's done this, I've been one of the people that he has sent sections to review, and I was just amazed when he first started. I thought that, I've never heard of some of this stuff, most of it. Yeah. But he continued starting in 2016. And then when did you actually put the final version out?
Yes.
Not even yet, is it?
Yeah, it's a good point. So I began sending out portions of this to people like Ray and other people to comment on, to offer improvements on in 2016. And then at the beginning of 2020, I put all of it online, and I keep updating it. So as I keep finding new stuff, I keep adding to it. And it's currently just over 5,000 pages, or just under 5,000 pages. I'm working on a new version that'll probably be just over 5,000 pages. So that's a major life milestone for me.
That's an amazing achievement in 6 years. An amazing achievement in 6 years. And yeah, so here begs the question. You said over and over again, where are the documents? Where's the proof? Okay. Why do you think that so much of this stuff, especially in the US, is being kept from the public? I mean, what is your gut hunch tell you?
Yeah, I mean, that really is one of the main unanswered questions. So from everything I've shown through these presentations, you can see that there's clearly a lot of stuff that exists and yet has not been released. I've shown you the yellow cards from the National Archives saying, we have this and you're not allowed to see it.
Yeah.
And I've shown you other things that must exist, interrogation reports and things, where we don't even have so much as a yellow card. So it's clear that a lot of stuff is being withheld. However, we don't have any evidence, we don't have any data on why it's being withheld. And all I can do is speculate. So, purely speculation might be right or wrong or half-baked. But you can easily imagine at the end of the war, at the end of World War II, the US, Soviet Union, other places were going into Germany, and they were all looking for a competitive advantage over the others. They all knew kind of the Cold War was coming, or if not the Cold War, then industrial rivalry. They were all looking for pieces of German technology they could grab and experts they could grab. And then they would want to keep that as secret as possible from everyone else. So you don't let the Russians know about this. And a further advantage of that is that then you can actually brag, hey, look what we invented. Look how great our country is. We invented this all by ourselves after the war. And I've shown you examples of that. So for various reasons, this would have been classified immediately after the war. Of course, things having to do with advanced weapons technology, nuclear weapons designs and things would naturally be highly classified. So you can understand why it was classified then. Now, over time, there may simply be inertia. This stuff has been classified for so long, we'll just leave it classified. It's been buried for so long. Nobody wants to spend the time to go dig through the warehouse and find it, right next to the Ark of the Covenant and bring it out of the warehouse and show people. So just bureaucratic inertia may be a good explanation for most of it. To the extent that, modern governments are even aware that this still exists, there may be some sense of embarrassment, embarrassed to admit that these things weren't quite invented where and by whom we thought they were. We're embarrassed to admit people like the SS General Hans Kammler were given shelter by the United States after the war and protection against the war crimes trials, or embarrassment in Germany or Austria about some of these wartime things. So it could be some sense of national embarrassment that's also keeping some of this withheld. But it's clear that there's a huge amount of information, and it's really scattered around the world. So the four major allied powers each grabbed a bunch of this. So the US, UK, France, Soviet Union. It's in all this corresponding archives, but other countries grab smaller amounts of this. I found information from as far away as Australia that was relevant to this. And of course, there's still some information still in Germany and Austria themselves. So my point in saying all this is I really encourage people to dig. I've only found the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole iceberg down there someplace. And if people are interested, they should go digging. They can find much more. And if you're not in the United States, dig where you are. So if you're in the Czech Republic, if you're in Australia, wherever you are, go dig through the archives you have. Or if you're in some of these areas in Europe where this work was being done, even consider doing industrial archaeology. These projects were developed at sites all over German-occupied Europe, and much of this stuff must still be buried in the ground. So it'd be possible to do industrial archaeology. Now, let me point out to anybody who considers that to be very, very careful. We don't know what's down there. Certainly we know that there were large amounts of nerve gas produced during the war. We know that Germans were very fond of booby trapping things at the end of the war with conventional explosives. So, don't hurt yourself by going digging. But anybody who's qualified, who has the expertise, has the capabilities, has the funding, has the legal permission, could go digging at some of these sites physically and answer some of these questions.
That when you were talking about these prototypes or these planes, that whatever, That's exactly what I was thinking. I was thinking it's in that warehouse next to the Ark of the Covenant, and that that's where they keep all that stuff. You know, so
Yes.
but it is such a mystery. I mean, it is Indiana Jones-esque. This whole story about all of that. It's just,
Right.
it really is amazing.
Yeah, it is hidden history that fits perfectly with your program.
Absolutely.
Yes, it surely is. And I would add that what you have done and are doing is not being done by many other people. It's a struggle. It's a lot of work. But let me ask you this: have you found that using Freedom of Information request, you've been able to obtain information uh, fairly readily?
A very small amount of what I show has come out through FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests.
Okay.
Almost everything was found just by digging in archives, things that had already been declassified.
I see.
In my experience, when people submit FOIA requests, they're very, very unlikely to get anything newly declassified back. Usually they will just dig through the archive and say, well, here's something that's already declassified. Let's send you that. So you could have, simply gotten that by going in person. Or occasionally they'll say, yeah, we have stuff, but we're not going to give it to you. So sometimes you do get that response back too. So a very small amount of my stuff has come from FOIA requests by various researchers, but the vast majority was me and a number of other researchers just brute force digging through the declassified archives for months and years at a time.
Yeah, and I do think that you're on to the rationale for why this information is not being released. I really liked your explanation, not just the inertia, the fact that no one's asking for it, but the insight that you have that there is embarrassment associated with it from various different sources makes it even more unlikely that it will become declassified. So what you've done to uncover information in already declassified sources, I think is very, very valuable to us. And
Thank you.
we really do appreciate you taking the time and the effort to put these presentations together for us. And I think we're seeing that there's a significant amount of interest in what you're doing. And hopefully by putting this information out, we can generate even more interest for you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, very good. Well, Ray, do we have anybody lined up for our next time?
Yeah, yes, we do. We have spoken with Dr. Judith Stauber of the Los Alamos Japan Institute.
Yeah.
And she's going to come and speak with us. And I think she's going to bring with her Clifton Truman Daniel,
Okay.
President Truman's grandson. We've had him on before, but they work together in relationships with Japan. And I think it'll make a very interesting discussion to have them. And I'm proud that she's agreed to do that for us next.
All right. Well, that sounds great. All right. Dr. Ryder, thank you so much for for the several times you've been on this program. It's been absolutely fascinating. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
All right. And folks, thanks for watching. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new Hidden History.